The summer heat pressed down on downtown Denver like a heavy blanket, making the asphalt shimmer and the air thick enough to taste. Sarah Walking Bear stood outside the corner grocery store, her weathered hands clutching a crumpled $5 bill and some loose change. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, jeans that had been mended more than once, and work boots that had walked too many miles on unforgiving concrete. She had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, working up the courage to go inside. Not because she was afraid of the store itself, but because of what always seemed to happen when she tried to shop in places like this. The stares, the whispers, the assumptions that followed her like shadows. Sarah needed milk. Her youngest daughter, Emma, was only 18 months old and had been crying all morning because they'd run out. The WIC vouchers wouldn't come through until next week, and her husband, Jake, wouldn't get paid from his construction job until Friday. But Emma needed milk now, and Sarah would do whatever it took to get it for her. She counted the money again. $4.73. She knew the milk cost $4.99, but maybe if she explained her situation, if she promised to bring the difference tomorrow, maybe the store owner would understand. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the glass door. The bell chimed overhead, and immediately she felt the familiar weight of eyes turning toward her. The store was small but clean, with narrow aisles packed tight with everything from canned goods to lottery tickets. Behind the counter stood Mr. Peterson, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and suspicious eyes. Near the beer cooler, 3 men in their 20s lounged against the wall. They wore baseball caps pulled low, T-shirts advertising local bars, and the kind of confident smirks that came from never having to worry about where their next meal was coming from. Sarah made her way to the dairy section and picked up a gallon of milk. She walked to the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That'll be $4.99, Peterson said flatly. Sarah placed her crumpled bills and change on the counter. "I have $4.73, she said quietly. "I know it's not enough, but my baby needs milk, and I can bring you the rest tomorrow when my husband gets paid. I promise." Peterson stared at the money without touching it. "Store policy," he said. "No credit. You want the milk? You pay full price." "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just 26 cents. My daughter hasn't had milk since yesterday morning." That's when the laughter started. The 3 men by the beer cooler had been listening, and now they were grinning at each other like they'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. The tallest one, wearing a Denver Broncos cap, stepped forward with an exaggerated swagger. "Hey, Chief," he called out, using the slur with deliberate malice. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you spent your casino money on firewater." His friends erupted in laughter. The second man, shorter but stockier, joined in. "Yeah, or maybe she should get a job instead of living off our tax dollars." "I do work," Sarah said, turning to face them with as much dignity as she could muster. "I clean office buildings at night. I'm just between paychecks." The third man, wearing a shirt that read, "American by birth, Southern by choice," shook his head mockingly. "Sure you do, sweetheart. And I'm sure that construction worker husband of yours is real reliable too." Sarah's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "You don't know anything about my husband or my family." "We know plenty," Broncos Cap said, stepping closer. "We know your people are always looking for handouts, always got some sob story about needing help." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd heard variations of them her entire life, but hearing them now, when she was just trying to buy milk for her baby, felt like being stripped naked in front of strangers. 26 cents, she said again, looking back at Peterson. "That's all I need." The store owner's face had gone carefully neutral. "Store policy," he repeated, but his voice was quieter now. "Come on, Peterson," the stocky man called out. "Don't enable her. These people need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. She was about to give up when the bell above the door chimed again. The man who walked in was tall and lean, probably in his 70s, with silver hair cut military short and lines on his face that spoke of decades under an unforgiving sun. He wore a simple button-down shirt, pressed khakis, and boots that had seen serious use but were maintained with obvious care. There was something about the way he carried himself that suggested a man accustomed to command. He surveyed the scene with sharp blue eyes. Sarah standing at the counter with her pathetic pile of change, the three men still snickering by the beer cooler, Peterson's uncomfortable neutrality. "Afternoon," he said, nodding to Sarah first, then to Peterson. He completely ignored the three men. The old man walked over to where the three men were standing, and suddenly their laughter died away. Up close, he was even more imposing, and there was something in his eyes that made grown men remember what it felt like to be scolded children. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he said, his voice conversational, but with an edge that could cut glass. "Did I hear correctly that you gentlemen were making jokes about this young lady's situation?" Bronco's Cap tried to maintain his swagger. "Just having a little fun, old man. No harm done." "No harm done," the old soldier repeated slowly. "Interesting perspective. Tell me, son, what's your name?" "Why do you want to know?" "Just making conversation. I'm Frank Morrison. Served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Retired Master Sergeant, United States Army. And you are?" The man's bravado flickered. "Travis Henderson." "Well, Travis Henderson, I have to say, I'm a little confused. See, where I come from, when a mother is trying to buy milk for her baby, decent folks either help out or mind their own business. They don't stand around making jokes about it." Travis shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we weren't really—" "Oh, but you were," Frank cut him off. "You were absolutely making jokes. In fact, let me see if I can remember them correctly." His voice took on a mocking tone. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you spent your casino money on firewater. Did I get that right?" The three men exchanged glances, suddenly looking less confident. Frank turned to the stocky man. "And you? What was it you said? Something about living off tax dollars?" He looked at the third man. "And you, with your clever comment about people needing to stand on their own feet. Tell me something, sons. What do you know about standing on your own feet?" None of them answered. "I'll tell you what I know," Frank continued. "I know this young lady works night shifts cleaning offices. I know she's here trying to buy milk for her baby with money she earned. I know she asked politely for help and offered to pay back what she owed. That tells me she's got more character in her little finger than the three of you combined." Frank began to pace slowly in front of them, like a drill sergeant addressing recruits. "You want to know what I think? I think you're exactly the kind of people who make this country weaker. You talk about American values, but you don't have the first clue what those actually mean." He stepped closer to Travis. "Real Americans don't mock mothers trying to feed their children. Real men don't gang up on someone who's down on their luck and make jokes about their misery." The store had gone completely silent. "Now," Frank continued, "here's what's going to happen. You three are going to apologize to this young lady. Real apologies. And then you're going to leave this store and think real hard about the kind of men you want to be." Travis found his voice again, but it came out smaller than before. "You can't tell us what to do." Frank smiled, but it wasn't pleasant. "Son, I've faced down Taliban fighters and Viet Cong. You think 3 boys from the suburbs scare me?" He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a wallet. From it, he extracted a business card and handed it to Travis. "That's my card. It has my name, my address, and my phone number. If you think I can't tell you what to do, you're welcome to test that theory." Travis looked at the card, his hands shaking slightly. The other 2 men had gone pale. "Of course," Frank continued. "There's an easier way. You could just be decent human beings. You could apologize and learn something from this experience." Finally, Travis stepped forward, his swagger completely gone. "I'm sorry," he said to Sarah, not meeting her eyes. We were out of line. What we said was wrong. The other two mumbled similar apologies. Frank nodded once. Better. Now get out. They hurried toward the door, the bell chiming frantically as they pushed through. Frank turned to Peterson. I believe the lady is trying to buy milk for her child. Peterson looked down at Sarah's money on the counter. Without a word, he swept the bills and coins into his hand and rang up the sale. Keep your change, he said quietly. Sarah stared at him in surprise. But I'm still short. No, Peterson said firmly. You're not short anything. Outside, Frank appeared beside her. Let me walk you to your car, he said. You didn't have to do that, Sarah said. Yes, I did, he replied simply. Those boys needed to learn something, and you needed to buy milk for your baby. Sarah looked at him more closely. You really were in the military? 38 years, Frank said. Learned that character isn't about where you come from or what you look like. It's about what you do when nobody's watching. Those men were watching, Sarah pointed out. Frank smiled genuinely. But they weren't really seeing. There's a difference. Sarah unlocked her car, an ancient Honda Civic. Why did you help me? You don't even know me. I know enough, Frank said. I know you're a mother trying to take care of her child. I know you work nights, which means you're willing to do whatever it takes. I know you asked politely and offered to pay back what you owed. That tells me everything about your character. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. That's the number for a friend of mine who runs a cleaning company. They're looking for daytime workers, good benefits, better pay. Tell him Frank Morrison sent you. Sarah stared at the paper. Why would you? Because everyone deserves a chance to build something better, Frank said. Sarah drove home through streets that somehow looked different. At home, Emma was crying. But when Sarah poured the fresh milk into her sippy cup, the crying stopped immediately. When Jake came home that evening, covered in dust and exhaustion, Sarah told him about what had happened. Something lit up in his eyes that she hadn't seen in months. The next morning, Sarah called the number Frank had given her. 3 days later, she started her new job. The pay was almost double, and for the first time in years, they offered health insurance. But more than the practical benefits, something had changed inside Sarah herself. The encounter with Frank Morrison had reminded her that she was worthy of respect, worthy of kindness, worthy of help when she needed it most. Months passed. Sarah and Jake saved enough to move into a better apartment. Sarah even started taking night classes, working toward the nursing degree she'd always dreamed about. One Saturday afternoon, while grocery shopping, Sarah spotted Frank in the produce section. She approached him nervously, Emma riding in the shopping cart. Mr. Morrison? He looked up and smiled immediately. Sarah, how are you doing? Really good, actually. I wanted to thank you again. And for the job referral. Tom Rodriguez is a wonderful boss. They talked for a few minutes about Sarah's new job, about Jake's recent promotion, about Emma's first words. As they prepared to part ways, Sarah gathered her courage. Mr. Morrison, would you like to come to dinner sometime? Jake's been wanting to meet you, and I make a pretty good pot roast. Frank's smile grew broader. I'd be honored, but only if you let me bring dessert. I make a mean apple pie. The dinner happened the following Sunday. Frank arrived exactly on time, carrying a pie and a small toy truck for Emma. Over pot roast and mashed potatoes, Frank told stories about his military service, painting vivid pictures of the places he'd seen and the people he'd met. You know, Frank said as they lingered over coffee and pie, I never did tell you the whole story about why I stepped in that day. Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. What do you mean? Frank was quiet for a moment. I had a son once, David. He was killed when he was 23. Car accident. He paused. But before that happened, he spent 2 years in the Peace Corps, working on a reservation in South Dakota. Sarah's breath caught. He used to write me letters about the families he was working with, the children he was teaching. He said it was the most important work he'd ever done, that those people taught him more about strength and dignity than any textbook ever could. Frank looked directly at Sarah. When I saw you in that store, being mocked by those boys who've never had to struggle for anything, I thought about David. I thought about what he would have done. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. I'm so sorry about your son. Don't be sorry, Frank said gently. Be proud, because every time you get up and take care of your family, every time you face down ignorance with dignity, you're honoring his memory. That dinner became the first of many. Frank became a surrogate grandfather to Emma and a trusted friend to Sarah and Jake. He was there when Emma took her first steps, when Sarah graduated from nursing school, when Jake started his own construction company. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand, Sarah would tell her the story of that day at the convenience store. The most important lesson, Sarah would say, isn't that there are cruel people in the world. The most important lesson is that there are also people like Frank Morrison, people who see injustice and decide to do something about it. Emma would grow up believing that standing up for others was as natural as breathing, that treating everyone with dignity was just what decent people did. Frank Morrison lived to be 89 years old. When he passed, Sarah and her family were among the hundreds who came to pay their respects. At the reception, Sarah met dozens of other people whose lives Frank had touched in similar ways. He never talked about any of this, Sarah said to Jake. That's because he didn't do it for recognition, Jake replied. He did it because it was right. They buried Frank with his son's Peace Corps badge in his breast pocket, and on his headstone they carved the words he'd lived by. Character is what you do when nobody's watching. Emma Walking Bear Morrison, she'd taken Frank's name as her middle name when she turned 18, graduated from college, and went to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Her specialty was economic development on reservations. Her first assignment took her to Pine Ridge, the same reservation where Frank's son David had served decades earlier. 3 years into her work there, Emma was in her office when she heard a commotion outside. Through her window, she could see a crowd gathering in the parking lot of the grocery store across the street. She hurried outside and saw a young Lakota woman holding the hand of a little boy, crying and clutching food stamps and loose change. Facing her were 3 construction workers, laughing and making the same kinds of cruel jokes Emma had heard about in her mother's story. Emma felt something cold settle in her chest. The details were different, but the scene was exactly the same. She pushed through the crowd. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority she remembered from Frank. "I couldn't help but notice there seems to be some kind of problem here." The 3 workers turned toward her, taking in her appearance. Young Native American, dressed in professional clothes that marked her as someone with education and position. "No problem here, lady," the first man said. "Just some people who need to learn to manage their money better." Emma smiled, but it wasn't warm. "I see. And you gentlemen work for which company exactly?" "Morrison Construction," the man said proudly. Emma felt her heart skip. Morrison Construction. Would that be Jake Morrison's company? The 3 men exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain. "Yeah. You know Jake." Emma's smile became genuine now. "Jake Morrison is my stepfather, and I think he'd be very interested to know how his employees are representing his company." The color drained from all 3 faces. "Now," Emma continued, pulling out her phone, "I could call Jake right now, or we could handle this differently." She turned to the young woman. "What's your name?" "Maria Crow Feather." "How much do you need, Maria?" $3.47. Emma pulled out a $20 bill and handed it to Maria. "Buy whatever else you need for your baby." She turned back to the construction workers. "You're going to remember that Jake Morrison built his company on treating people with respect. If I hear about anything like this again, our next conversation will be very different." The men nodded quickly and hurried away. As the crowd dispersed, Maria approached Emma. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." Emma thought about Frank Morrison, about the legacy he'd left. "Yes, I did. Someone once did the same thing for my mother, and it changed everything." Maria smiled through her tears. Maybe someday I can do the same for someone else. I'm counting on it, Emma said, and as she watched Maria walk into the store, Emma knew that Frank Morrison's spirit lived on, not in monuments, but in moments like this, when ordinary people chose to be extraordinary, when kindness defeated cruelty, and when the simple act of standing up for others created waves that would continue spreading long after everyone involved had forgotten the original stone that disturbed the water. The next evening, Emma called her mother from her small apartment on the reservation. Sarah was now a head nurse at Denver General Hospital, her voice filled with the confidence that came from years of success and respect in her profession. "Mum," Emma said, settling into her worn armchair with a cup of tea, "something happened today that reminded me of your story about Frank Morrison." Sarah's voice softened immediately. "Tell me." Emma recounted the incident at the grocery store, how she'd stepped in just as Frank had done decades before, how the construction workers had turned out to be employees of Jake's company. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You know," Sarah finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "Frank always said that the real test of character wasn't what you did when people were watching, but what you did when you thought nobody would ever know." But people were watching today," Emma pointed out, echoing the same words her mother had spoken to Frank all those years ago. Sarah laughed softly, remembering, "That's exactly what I told him. And you know what he said? He said they weren't really seeing. There's a difference between looking and seeing, between hearing and listening." Emma stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I think I understand now. Those 3 men today, they were looking at Maria, but they only saw what they expected to see. A stereotype, a problem, someone beneath them." "And what did you see?" Sarah asked. "I saw myself. I saw you. I saw every mother who's ever had to choose between pride and her child's needs." Emma paused. "I saw someone worth defending." The conversation continued for another hour, mother and daughter separated by hundreds of miles, but connected by something deeper than geography. They talked about Frank's legacy, about how one moment of courage in a convenience store had changed the trajectory of their entire family. "Do you think he knew?" Emma asked as they prepared to hang up. "Do you think Frank knew that helping us that day would create all of this?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think Frank Morrison was the kind of man who helped people because it was right, not because of what it might lead to. But I also think he understood something most people don't, that kindness is never wasted. It always finds a way to come back into the world, usually when we need it most." After they said goodbye, Emma sat in her quiet apartment, thinking about the invisible threads that connected people across time and space. Tomorrow, she would continue her work helping families on the reservation build better lives. Maria Crow Feather would feed her baby and maybe, someday, help someone else in return. And somewhere in Denver, Jake Morrison would have a conversation with his employees about respect and dignity that might prevent similar scenes from ever happening again. The circle of kindness that began with a 26-cent shortage and an old soldier's courage continued to expand, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, proving that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in grocery stores and convenience shops, one act of decency at a time. 2 weeks later, Emma received an unexpected visitor at her office. Maria Crow Feather stood in the doorway, holding her baby daughter and wearing a shy but determined smile. The infant was plump and healthy, her dark eyes bright and curious as she looked around the room. "I hope you don't mind me coming by," Maria said softly. "I asked around until someone told me where you worked. I wanted to thank you again and to tell you something." Emma gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit down. How are you and the baby doing?" Maria settled into the chair, adjusting her daughter on her lap. "We're doing well. Really well, actually. That's what I wanted to tell you about." She took a deep breath. "After what happened that day, I kept thinking about what you said, about helping someone else when I got back on my feet." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "I got a job last week. Night shift at the hospital in town, cleaning the same buildings my grandmother used to clean 40 years ago. It's honest work, and it pays enough for us to get by." Emma smiled warmly. "That's wonderful news, Maria. You should be proud of yourself." "I am," Maria said, and there was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. "But I also remembered something my grandmother used to tell me. She said that when someone helps you climb out of a hole, the first thing you should do is reach back down and help the next person climbing up." She handed Emma the envelope. "There's $40 in there. I know it's not much, but I was hoping you could start something with it. A fund, maybe, for other mothers who find themselves short a few dollars when they're trying to buy food for their children." Emma opened the envelope and saw the bills inside, neatly folded and accompanied by a handwritten note that read, "In memory of Frank Morrison, who taught us that kindness is never small when it comes from a big heart." "Maria," Emma said, her voice catching slightly, "this is incredibly generous, but are you sure you can afford this?" Maria's smile was radiant now. "Ms. Morrison, 2 weeks ago I was counting pennies to buy formula for my baby. Today I have a job, a future, and hope. I can afford to give back because someone gave to me first. That's how the circle works, isn't it?" Emma nodded, thinking of her mother's stories, of Frank Morrison's quiet wisdom, of all the small moments that had led to this one. "Yes," she said softly, "that's exactly how it works." And so the Frank Morrison Memorial Fund was born, not with fanfare or official ceremonies, but with $40 from a grateful mother and a promise to keep the circle of kindness turning. Emma put up a simple notice in the community center explaining that the fund existed to help families bridge small gaps when they were trying to buy necessities for their children. Within a month, word had spread throughout the reservation and beyond. A tribal elder contributed $50 and a story about Frank Morrison helping his grandson get into college. A group of high school students organized a car wash and donated the proceeds. Even Jake's construction company made a contribution, along with a new policy requiring sensitivity training for all employees. The fund grew not because of large donations, but because of small ones, each accompanied by its own story of kindness received and kindness given. And at the heart of it all was the simple truth that Frank Morrison had understood from the beginning, that the measure of a person isn't in their wealth or status, but in their willingness to stand up for others when it matters most. 6 months after the fund's creation, Emma received a call that would bring the story full circle in ways she never could have imagined. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, an elderly woman with a slight tremor that spoke of advanced age. "Is this Emma Morrison?" the woman asked. "The young lady who started the Frank Morrison Memorial Fund?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma replied. "How can I help you?" "My name is Dorothy Chen," the woman said. "I was Frank Morrison's neighbor for over 20 years. I'm calling because I have something that I think belongs with your fund." Emma's heart raced. "Something of Frank's?" "In a way, yes. You see, dear, Frank never told many people about this, but after his son David died, he started keeping a journal. He wrote in it every time he helped someone, not to brag or keep score, but because he said it helped him remember why David's life had mattered." Dorothy's voice grew softer. "Frank passed away in his sleep, as you know, but before he died, he gave me specific instructions about what to do with that journal. He said if anyone ever started something in his memory that truly captured what he believed in, I should give it to them." Emma could barely speak. "Mrs. Chen, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, dear. Just keep doing what you're doing. Frank would be so proud to know that his story didn't end with him, that it's still helping people find their way to kindness." 3 days later, Dorothy Chen arrived at Emma's office carrying a worn leather journal bound with a simple string. Inside were dozens of entries written in Frank's careful handwriting, each one documenting a moment when he had chosen to help rather than walk away. Emma read through the entries with tears streaming down her face. There was the story of helping a young veteran find housing after returning from Iraq. An entry about fixing an elderly woman's car every winter for 15 years, never charging for parts or labor. A note about mentoring a teenager through high school and college, celebrating when the boy became a successful engineer. But it was the entry dated 3 months before Frank's death that made Emma sob openly. Today, I met a young woman named Sarah Walking Bear in Peterson's store. She needed 26 cents to buy milk for her baby, and 3 young men were making cruel jokes about her situation. I thought about David, about what he taught me during his time on the reservation, about how dignity costs nothing to give but everything to lose. I helped her, and I hope I did it in a way that honored both her strength and my son's memory. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest changes. I pray this woman and her family find the happiness they deserve. At the bottom of the page, Frank had added a final note. If anyone reads this after I'm gone, know that every person I helped taught me something about courage. Sarah Walking Bear taught me that asking for help when your child needs it isn't weakness. It's the purest form of love. Emma closed the journal and sat in the silence of her office, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. That evening she called her mother and read Frank's words aloud, both women crying as they heard his voice again across the years. "He wrote about us, Mom," Emma whispered. "He remembered us." "Of course he did," Sarah replied through her tears. "We were part of his story, just like he became part of ours." The journal became the centerpiece of the Frank Morrison Memorial Fund, displayed in a place of honor in the community center alongside photos and stories from the dozens of families the fund had helped. Visitors would read Frank's entries and understand that kindness wasn't random or accidental. It was a choice, made deliberately and repeatedly by someone who understood that the true measure of a life isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you give away. A year later, on the anniversary of Frank's death, Emma organized the first annual Frank Morrison Day of Kindness. The event wasn't a somber memorial, but a celebration of action, with volunteers spreading throughout the reservation and surrounding communities to perform acts of service in Frank's honor. Sarah traveled from Denver to participate, bringing Jake and now 3-year-old Emma's younger brother Michael, who had been born the year after Frank's death. The little boy carried a small backpack filled with granola bars and juice boxes to distribute to anyone who looked hungry, unconsciously mimicking the spirit of generosity that had shaped his family's story. During the event, Emma stood before a crowd of over 200 people gathered in the community center. Behind her hung a banner that read, "Character is what you do when nobody's watching." And beside it was Frank's journal, open to the page where he had written about Sarah. "Frank Morrison never asked to be a hero," Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "He never wanted parades or recognition or days named in his honor. He simply believed that when you see someone who needs help, you help them. When you witness injustice, you speak up. When you have the power to make someone's day a little better, you use it." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. Native American families, white ranchers, Latino farm workers, all united by their commitment to honoring Frank's memory through action. But here's what I've learned from studying his journal and from hearing the stories of everyone he touched. Frank Morrison didn't just help individuals. He helped us remember who we're supposed to be. He reminded us that America's strength doesn't come from the size of our military or the wealth of our corporations. It comes from ordinary people making extraordinary choices to stand up for each other. In the audience, Travis Henderson sat in the back row, now a married father of 2 who had driven 3 hours from Denver to attend the event. After his encounter with Frank 7 years earlier, he had gradually transformed from a man who mocked others' struggles into someone who volunteered at homeless shelters and taught his children that treating everyone with dignity wasn't just good manners. It was a moral obligation. He had never spoken directly to Sarah or Emma about that day in the convenience store, But every year he made an anonymous donation to the Frank Morrison Memorial Fund, accompanied by a note that simply read, "From someone who learned the hard way that character matters more than comfort." As Emma concluded her speech, she announced the fund's latest milestone. They had now helped over 500 families bridge small financial gaps that might otherwise have meant the difference between dignity and desperation. Each assistance came with no strings attached, no requirements for repayment, and no judgment about circumstances, just the simple recognition that everyone deserves help when they need it most. Frank Morrison taught us that kindness isn't complicated, Emma said, as the crowd began to disperse for their volunteer assignments. It doesn't require special training or advanced degrees or perfect circumstances. It just requires us to see each other as human beings worthy of respect and care. That evening, as volunteers returned from their day of service, they shared stories of small miracles, groceries delivered to elderly neighbors, playground equipment repaired at a local school, medical bills paid for families facing impossible choices. Each act was modest in scope, but profound in impact, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Sarah found herself standing beside Frank's memorial display, reading his words about her family for the dozenth time. Jake joined her, putting his arm around her shoulders as they watched their children play with other kids from the community. "Do you think he knew?" Sarah asked quietly. "Do you think Frank understood that helping us that day would lead to all of this?" Jake considered the question thoughtfully. "I think Frank Morrison was smart enough to know that kindness has a way of multiplying itself, but I also think he would be amazed to see how far the ripples have spread." Emma approached them, tired but glowing with satisfaction from the day's success. "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet." She led them to where Maria Crow Feather stood with her now toddler daughter and a man Emma didn't recognize. "This is Robert," Emma said, "Maria's husband. They got married last month." Robert stepped forward, extending his hand to Sarah. "Mrs. Morrison, I've heard so much about your family. Maria told me how you all helped her when she needed it most. I wanted you to know that she's been talking about starting a mentorship program for young mothers on the reservation, based on everything she learned from your daughter." Sarah smiled warmly. "That sounds wonderful. And please, call me Sarah." As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Emma stood in the empty community center, looking at Frank's journal one last time. Tomorrow she would return it to its display case, but tonight she wanted to read his words once more, to remember the man whose simple act of courage had changed so many lives. On the final page of the journal, she found an entry she had somehow missed before, dated just a week before Frank's death. "I've been thinking lately about legacy, about what we leave behind when our time here is done. I used to think legacy was about big accomplishments, about being remembered for important things. But now I understand that real legacy lives in the quiet moments, in the small choices that teach others how to be better than they were before. If I've done anything worthwhile in this life, it's shown a few people that standing up for others isn't heroic, it's just human. And if they pass that lesson on to someone else, then maybe my boy David's death wasn't entirely in vain." Emma closed the journal and wiped tears from her eyes, understanding finally that she wasn't just carrying on Frank Morrison's work. She was proving that his faith in human goodness had been justified all along.